I have some gray hairs, but not quite enough to be wise. So I was very happy that Kevin, when he gave the intro talk opening the conference, called it Perils of Wisdom, which I think is a much better title. And now I don't quite want to go with perilous, so I'm going to go with oysters of advice. And the other thing I'm changing is it's really targeted to new and disgruntled faculty. And we may have some disgruntled faculty here, I'm not sure. But I'm not going to talk about the job search stuff, although I'm happy to talk about that kind of stuff offline. I'm really going to talk about my advice on having an enjoyable career as a professor. So the reason I'm talking about living in paradise, there's a great essay that Paul Graham wrote, which is his advice on how to be an undergraduate student and what to do after that. And he talks about going to grad school and says grad school is close to paradise other than this problem of having to write a dissertation. But most of you are, if you're getting close to finishing grad school or are new faculty, have got over that hurdle. So we can do some simple algebra. And if you were paradise minus a dissertation as a grad student, now you've got a dissertation, you are a professor, and you should be in paradise. And of course, Paul Graham is correct. All the things about what a professor can do are really paradisical. You get to work with whoever you want. You get to work on whatever you want. You get to work whenever you want. You get to wear whatever you want. You actually own your own work and can do pretty much whatever you want with it. If you read the fine print of your university contract, you don't actually own your own work, but the university are smart enough to generally let it go and assume that you do own your own work, unless it becomes really, really valuable and then they want a piece of it. But otherwise, you own it. And you get to fail without real consequences, unlike most people who have real jobs. And if you want to sort of realize how amazing faculty jobs are, go into Walmart and try to explain what a sabbatical is. And that not only can you, go walk away from your job and do whatever you want for a year or often more on leave, but they'll actually keep paying you some fraction of your salary while you do that. So this is something that people talk about, like when I talk about real job, that's like the 99%. We may not all be in the 1% as far as income, but in terms of having a great job and something that everyone most people can only dream of, we're definitely in the 1%. So that raises this paradox. If we have these wonderful paradisical jobs, why are there so many miserable professors? And it is the case that there do seem to be many miserable professors. For the new tenure-track ones, it's often because they're so stressed out about tenure that they forget that they have all these wonderful things and they don't really have to do anything other than what they want. For the older ones, the disgruntled ones, it's often because they were so stressed to get tenure that by the time they got it, they're so burned out that they are still trapped in the situation where they're doing all these things they don't want. So my hope in this talk is to convince you that, yes, being a professor is paradise, and if you're not enjoying it, then you're doing something wrong. So I should caution you that this is my advice as an individual. There are two main kinds of advice. There's lots of sort of committee consensus advice that is probably correct because lots of people agree on it. It's generally agreeable. It's generally pretty obvious, so you don't get much out of it. Then there's individual advice, which is probably wrong because this is just my arrogant opinion from my own life experience, which is very particular to me and probably different from all of yours. But individual advice is often interesting and hopefully even if you shouldn't follow it. And one of the best articles about how to be a professor that I know is Reddick and Agpal's that starts by telling people not to follow any advice. So I think that's good advice. And I would encourage that to read and listen to lots of advice that comes from opinionated individuals, but don't follow it. So I know this is after the poster session, and people hopefully enjoyed the free liquor provided by Usenix. So I want to make sure you're all paying attention. So we should have a quiz. So I have two examples of advice. And The question is, which one of those came from a committee and which one came from an individual? So no one bold enough to answer. Yes? Okay, you mean your left or my left? Okay, yes, so it's actually worse. It's a joint committee. So the only thing less useful than a regular committee is a joint committee, and especially if it's involving ACM and IEEE. So that's about as bad as you can get. The one on the right is, of course, from Edgar Dijkstra, which is forgivable since Java didn't yet exist, so it's okay that he was ripping on COBOL. So I want to make sure you realize that you shouldn't listen to me, and make sure you don't follow my advice, because I don't want to be accused of leading any of you astray. And 6 years from now, when you don't get tenure and you're driving a taxi cab or a bum in the street, you'll come back and blame me because you followed what I said in this Usenix talk. So I want to make sure that's clear. And there's no doubt that I've been extremely lucky in my career, and there are lots of things that end up being very much down to random luck, that whether they go the right way or not, or you make the right decision or not, and it's 50-50 decision, end up making people have a good career or not. I also started my career back when things were fun and easy. Back in Usenix 10, 15 years ago, we could solve easy problems like preventing buffer overflows, and people could still think that was important. And I guess now we've given up on that and just trying to make it harder to exploit them. But the other part of this is the more relevant, that I had no major responsibilities until well after having tenure. And I know that's not the case for you. I didn't have children. I hope some of you met my daughter earlier during the conference, but I didn't have children until after having tenure. I know that's not the case for you. So a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you are probably much harder for you to do than they would be for me to do. Now, I do have one thing to help the people that have children or other major responsibilities already, which is one of the very stressful things I know about being a parent is worrying about if your child shows up in kindergarten and is behind on her theoretical computer science education. That would be really distressing, and as a computer science faculty member, you have a special burden to do that. So I do have one thing to help out with that I do have a book that you can use for that. So if anyone has a child who's behind on their computer science education, my door prize is a book. No one? Okay, we have one taker. Maybe Kevin, can you be the... It's okay if you don't have children. If the people with children, I'll get them. Okay, so that is my... the only thing I can really offer to help people that may have more responsibilities than I had in my early career. So I should give you some reasons why you should listen to me, because I don't want people to go back and refill their drinks next door until the panel that hopefully will be very interesting starts. So the first reason is I have taught a large number of students, about 500,000. I haven't remembered all of their names, but I think I have learned quite a bit from many of the students that I've taught, and I'm very proud of the things that many of the students have gone on to do. So hopefully I have learned a thing or two from that. The second reason is I did get tenure. I've even actually become a full professor without the shame of publishing a single journal paper. And I'm not sure I recommend this route for everyone. And this is actually a page from my promotion case. But it's at least worked for me. And the third reason is I'm going to very quickly make some big, bold claims without really supporting them now because we don't have that much time. But I'm happy to meet with anyone outside this forum to give more of my experience. And hopefully, if I have anything useful to say, happy to meet with anyone about that. And I can even buy you a coffee to enable this. OK, so hopefully that's enough to make it worthwhile to listen. No one has left yet, as far as I can see, if you got your door prize. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to spend your time. And this is really the most important decision you have to make. It's the most limited, unreplenishable resource you have. And people often talk about time as money, and that's really the wrong thing to measure time as. How you spend your time really reflects your values. And your decisions about what you value should influence how you spend your time. And if you are spending your time in a way that doesn't match your values, then there's a big mismatch there. So that's the first thing that you have to keep in mind. So that raises the question how much you should work. And there is a work-life panel. So people that are still working at 9:30 tonight will hear more about that if this is considered work. But my answer is that the goal is you should work definitely no more than 10 hours a year. That anything beyond that is really excessive. And this is defining work as the 99%ers define work, not the 1% that we are define work. So work is stuff that you do because if you don't do it, you'll get fired, and it has no other value or no other reason for doing it. And about the only work that I have to do, and I know this is a little different at different universities, is I have to fill in an annual report, which is really painful and demoralizing and soul-crushing. But if you don't do it, you're not eligible for raises. So it's kind of the one thing that, at least once you have tenure, they can't fire you for not doing it, but they can decide not to give you raises. And you can see an example of how, if you can read that, demoralizing it is, that in order to move up from the does not meet expectations to partially meets expectations category in teaching, what you have to do is cancel classes. So as long as you pay enough attention to that and make sure, you've got to cancel more than one class. Canceling one class is not enough. So you've got to make sure you've read the standards that the dean has for measuring faculty performance at least a week before the end of the semester to do well. But once you've done that, you've got over the bar. And at least if your only goal is getting tenure, that's really all that matters as far as teaching. As long as students aren't running to the dean complaining, nothing that you do in teaching is really impacting your tenure. But hopefully that's not the main thing that's motivating you. So one of the big dilemmas you face as a tenure-track faculty member is you've got hopefully a pretty clear idea of things that matter by that stage in your life. You went into research because you cared about intellectually interesting problems, because you want to make the world better, because you like doing things that involve solving problems and things that you find personally fulfilling. And how you balance those things, everyone figures out on their own, but you've got some pretty clear idea, hopefully, of things that matter. And then you've got some vague notion that you're told of, well, here's the things that count. That if you want to stay in paradise or stay in this horrible, miserable job that you think you have while you're suffering trying to get tenure, there are these things that count for that. And maybe some of them intersect with the things that you think matter, but a lot of them don't. And so the miserable faculty have this dilemma of saying, well, what should you spend your time on? Am I being irresponsible by spending my time on the things that matter to me that aren't in that red circle of the things that count, and not spending the time on the things that I think are soul-crushing and demoralizing that are in that other part of the red circle? And if you look at things this way, it sort of does seem like it's a real dilemma. But the good news is that there isn't a red circle like that there isn't some mysterious list of things that count. It's something more like this, that there's a weird sort of fuzzy thing that moves around that no one really knows where it is, because what's really going on to get tenure is you've got to convince, to get your PhD, you've got to convince 3 to 5 people that already have PhDs that you deserve one. To get tenure, you've got to convince probably somewhere around 20 people that already have tenure that you deserve it. Right? So there's no real clear definition of what counts and what doesn't. People think there is, but there isn't. And if whatever mysterious definition of what counts doesn't match what you think matters well enough that by working on what matters, you're not going to get there, then it's probably not the right job for you. So you should not worry about this dilemma. Other than if there are very small little things that you can spend that 10 hours a year that you're actually allowed to work, and what you have left after filling in the annual report, it's okay if you spend those on things that are in the red circle but not in the orange circle. Okay, so once you've decided that, then you've got to figure out, well, you still have, unlike a grad student that usually has a very limited range of things they're working on, as a faculty member, you've got a whole bunch of stuff to do. So you've still got to divide your time. And my advice on that is to really think about the trade-offs between the energy you put in something and the value you get out of it. So most people think there's sort of a linear, it's natural to think there's a linear correlation between those two. And for very few tasks is that true, and especially for tasks that are sort of the creative, interesting tasks that we get to work on. That the curve is something more like this, where there's some level that if you don't get over that, it's embarrassing and probably can cause problems. And then there's this big range of places where you can put a lot more effort into something, but there's very little clear value, and sometimes more effort makes it less valuable, and sometimes maybe it makes it a little more valuable. And then there's things that you put enough energy in to get over this pinnacle of extraordinariness. Something that really will stand out and really have some lasting value. So your goal in terms of how you spend your time should be make sure for the things that you don't think are the most important or don't think you can contribute the most to, you at least get over the abyss of embarrassment. And you might have to overshoot a little bit because it's kind of risky if you aim for that, just getting over that threshold, and you might miss it. But then don't waste your time sort of moving up and down through the trough of mediocrity. Pick the things that you really want to excel at and that you think you're uniquely qualified to do and that you can do that no one else can do, and get over the pinnacle of extraordinariness on those things. And one of the things that I hope all of you that go into academic positions want to be extraordinary in is teaching. And this has to be really just because it matters to you and because you find it personally fulfilling and valuable to do it. Anyone who tells you that that's important for your tenure case, at least at every research-focused institution I know of, that's not true. So there are administrators who might tell you that, but until they can point to someone who had a strong research record and brought in lots of money but didn't get tenured because they were a mediocre teacher, you shouldn't believe them. If you're at an institution that has someone like that, I would love to hear about it. So how do you be an extraordinary teacher? The good news is the standard for ordinariness is so low in universities, in computer science, but in universities in general, that you don't have to do much to get over this extraordinary bar. And the two things I would say that are really enough to get there are if you respect your students' time. And once you do that, that's going to lead to lots of other things like showing up for class on time and being prepared for class and not giving busy work. And the second thing is probably the one that is much less common, is to focus on what you want to do that impacts your students 5 years from now, rather than what you can do that they'll be able to show you sitting on an uncomfortable chair for a few hours at the end of the semester. And if you think about what you're doing in teaching based on those two simple steps, I think that's enough to be an extraordinary teacher already. The one specific thing I'll talk about is grading. So in order to do that, you're going to have to manage your time. I know at least the new faculty orientation at my university, they spend half the time on sort of the things they're worried that you might do that would get the university sued, and the other half of the time talking about grading, and none of the time talking about actually teaching. Hopefully other universities might do something better. But I think one of the things that is where most of the effort is wasted is people spending a lot of time worrying about grading rather than teaching. And if you're spending a lot of time on grading, you should ask yourself why. And usually the reason ends up coming down to feeling some kind of moral obligation to help Capital One or some second-tier company distinguish between the B- and the B+ students who they're going to be able to hire, and helping them filter out who they're going to interview. And that's really not your job. That you want to be teaching to hopefully inspire and educate students. You want to be able to identify the ones that you want to recruit for your research group, especially if you're teaching early classes where it's most valuable to do that. You want to be able to give enough feedback to students to know if they're in the right major and if they should go on to the later classes. But it's really not something that you need to spend a lot of time on. And I would encourage you to have a grading scale like the one that I use that solves a lot of the problems and saves a lot of the time people spend quibbling over points. And this was something that was recommended by a student, that it's a lot easier if you can just give colored stars. Of course, there'll be students that when you do this will complain, well, what was the average on this assignment? And if it's sort of a murky greenish gold star, then they're usually satisfied. You don't want to have such a limited scale, so you don't want to sort of limit your expectations of what students can do. You want to give opportunities to do better, and this is one of the sort of dangers of the 100-point taking points off scale. I have not yet had to give out like a quadruple star or a quintuple star, but I do encourage students in my intro CS classes to shoot for them. The other thing that I'll talk about some is, one of the things that most stresses out people becoming faculty members is fundraising. You should feel pretty comfortable with research. If you've completed a PhD, you know how to do that. You might not have the experience of managing a research group as much, but people are often very stressed about funding. And it's different to learn to write proposals, and it's something that will take some time to get used to for most people. I would encourage you that the best model of a proposal I know of is the one Alan Turing wrote, along with 3 others at Bletchley Park during World War II. They wrote to Winston Churchill asking for funds to support the cryptanalysis efforts that were being done at Bletchley Park. It's a 3-page proposal. I would encourage you to read it. You'll find it on the web. And Churchill's response was, within a day, action this day and give them everything they want. So those of us who go through the cycle of sending something to NSF and 9 months later hearing back may be envious of getting a proposal funded within a day and getting everything you want. But if you read Turing's proposal, you'll feel like it's probably fair that his got that quick response and yours took 9 months to decide. And from this, you can learn a few tips on writing proposals. The first is you've got to target your audience, right? He knew he was writing to Winston Churchill. He wrote it with that audience in mind. The tricky thing that you face is you have less clarity on who your audience is. And it includes both thorough, competent reviewers that are going to spend a lot of time figuring out the details of your proposal, trying to work out kind of whether it all makes sense and go through the technical parts, and lazy, grumpy reviewers who are looking for some reason to kill it and will be upset if there aren't nice pictures on the first couple of pages. So you want to try to write a proposal that's going to be appealing to both of those audiences. The other thing I would strongly encourage you to do is write fewer proposals. You're going to probably get advice, especially from people who benefit from the overhead that comes in on your proposals, to write more and more proposals. It's not something that I would encourage. You probably shouldn't write more than 1 or 2 a year in your first few years, and maybe 2 or 3 after that. But it's something that if you go down this path of writing more and more proposals, they're going to be worse and worse, and you're going to get more and more frustrated as they get rejected. And so you should only write proposals that you really need to write, and not write proposals to get for prestige or because you're getting pressured from administrators or you think you need more on your CV. Remember that the funding that you're getting when your proposal is successful is coming from the people working at Walmart. So if you're doing it just to build your CV and not because you have something worthwhile to do with the funds, that's a really bad reason to write a proposal. The other danger, if you're writing too many, you're probably not getting very useful feedback on them. Don't expect to get feedback from the reviews that come back. It's going to be 9 months after you wrote the proposal, so you've probably forgotten about it and don't want to deal with it. If it's a rejection, that's all you're going to get out of it. You want to write proposals early enough that you can get feedback from colleagues and send proposals to people in a mature enough stage where people can give you meaningful comments, but early enough that you can benefit from those comments. And the other counter advice I'll give you, lots of advice tells people to diversify their funding sources. I think this is often part of the official consensus of advice for new faculty. I would encourage you not to diversify your funding sources. You want to get the least restrictive, lowest management, lowest sort of grunt work and annoyance for you funding that you can. In the US, at least, that means NSF. And you should be very wary of programs that end up funding people to do research but don't really understand what research is and expect you to be send a monthly report about everything that you've done and hire an administrator to manage the grant. And then you'll need a new grant to fund that administrator afterwards. So I would encourage you not to diversify your funding sources. Try to find a few good ones and get what you need from them. The last, actually, next to last thing I'll say, and it's good that we're at Usenix, be open. And this means a lot of things in a lot of ways. So open publishing is part of it. You will probably not be able to only publish in open venues like Usenix, but you should try to as much as possible. When you do publish in venues that have restricted copyrights, you should change the copyright forms that they ask you to sign. At least half the time they won't notice. So go ahead, cross things out, make it what you actually want to sign and send it back. The other half of the time they do notice. And when they notice, that usually means they have to have a big discussion about it and get their lawyers involved. And eventually they come back to you and say maybe they're willing to adjust some things, or either you better sign the original one or they'll throw out your paper and then you sign the original one. But it's very little effort for you to cross things out and a lot of effort and good decision process for them to deal with if every author starts doing this. So I encourage all of you to. The other kind of openness is the more being open and not being paranoid. Lots of people are kind of reluctant to talk about what they're doing with other researchers and fear that if they hint at their idea or the project they're working on, someone's going to steal it and go off and scoop them. And that is a really disruptive way to be, both to you and the community. And it really, if you think the idea you have is so brilliant that merely by mentioning it to someone, they're going to run off and scoop you on it, then probably you're deluding yourself about how brilliant your idea is. But you're going to benefit. And if they are working on something similar, better to collaborate than compete, at least to learn from what each other is doing. The other kind of openness is sharing your code and data. And that's something that everyone gets a lot of benefit from, even if it's not something that obviously counts in your tenure case. And a lot of times it may end up actually counting because people who end up using your code will benefit from it and do things that will enhance your research as well as theirs. So the overall theme, I think, is you're going to be much better off if you are willing to challenge conventions rather than doing the same thing everyone else does. That if you do the same thing everyone else does, you either have to be smarter than them or work harder to stand out. Whereas if you do something a little different, then you can get away with being lazier and less smart and still succeed. So that's a good thing. You shouldn't take that so far that you break things that are important norms, and figuring out where the line there is and kind of how many laws you want to break, and that's a tricky problem, but you should think about things in those terms. So the two things I would recommend everyone reads or views, the first one is something to read, the second one is something to view. Reddick and Nagpal has a post in Scientific America that I think doesn't completely agree with what I've told you, but that's a good thing, and you shouldn't follow my advice or hers, which he will tell you as well. And Randy Pausch has a video on time management that I would encourage you to watch. So I will hand things, I don't know if we have time for questions now, or we should go to, we have time for questions now? Okay, good. So I'd be happy to take questions or comments or objections now. And I have a few remaining door prizes for, I guess Kevin has some as well. Everyone's already in paradise. That's good. Yeah. I will post them on my site. I'm planning to post some more than what's in the slides on my site, which hopefully will happen by next week. Yes?
Oh, actually,
Ready? Oh.
Do you have one? Okay. So I have a question. Whoa, sorry. I know a lot of young faculty try to also start startups and maybe have some things on the side. Can you talk a little bit about how to work that in, if that's what you want to do, or not?
So there are lots of ways to do that. So one of the very hard things for anyone who has a real job to understand is university will let you go on leave to do that. And so I've had time on leave being involved with doing a startup, and that's something that I think is, some people manage to do it without going on leave and do it on the side, and I think there are touchy things you have to worry about if you start having students that are both working for the company and working in your research group, and whether you might be derailing them from what they should be doing because of that. I haven't tried to do that. I've been involved in some startups, but it's been quite separate from my research when I've done it. It's definitely something that if you're driven to do it, it's much better to be in a position as a faculty member where you can have your comfy, reliable job to go back to if the startup doesn't work out than people who don't have that luxury.
So how much of your experience and your advice do you think is directly attributable to the university where you happen to be a professor versus everyone in this room?
So I've only been a professor at one university, so certainly my experience is limited by that. I've definitely heard stories about other universities where the tenure process is particularly demeaning and difficult and unpleasant. I think that's fairly rare. Like, I think University of Virginia is a wonderful place, and I'm very happy I've been there. But I think most universities that are research focused and still value education and are, I think the experience is not that different, although maybe I do meet a lot of miserable faculty from other places, so I don't know. But maybe, I guess, other people who have been at other universities might be able to answer that question better than I can. Thank you.
He's around for coffee.
I am around.